Okay, so welcome to the fourth and final episode in this webinar series to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the doctoral program in educational research. So this program, DPER, as it's called, DPER, is celebrating 25 years, and obviously for reasons of the COVID pandemic, we can't all be together to celebrate it. So instead, we're hosting this series of meetings online, which will be made available as a recording afterwards. The previous episodes in this webinar series have been devoted to various topics. The present episode is devoted towards the topic of research. One of the things that's interesting about DPER is that it is a doctorate for professionals, but it is a PhD. It's not a professional doctorate of the kind that you might think of in relationship to things like EdDs. So, of course, what that means, among other things, is that the program has a very close relationship to research and scholarship. And that's going to be the focus of this episode. We've got three people who are scheduled to speak. Hugh McFall is a current student on the program. Paul Clemen is an alumni of the program. And Gemma Derek is a teacher or a member of academic staff who teaches on the program. And we're going to invite each of them to talk in the first part of this webinar in turn about their own research interests, to give a flavour of the kind of thing that people involved in the program in different ways are interested in. And subsequently, we'll try and foster a conversation about some of those research interests and the things that arise from them, and so we can hopefully have a bit more of an interactive discussion. So I'm going to introduce each of the speakers in turn as they're due to speak, since that will make more sense. So I'm going to invite Hugh McFall to speak first. So apologies for entering my reading voice. Hugh McFall is Senior Lecturer in Law at the Open University and Director of the Open Justice Centre, which promotes socially engaged legal education for the public good. Hugh has won several awards for his use of technology to widen access to legal education and has pioneered a series of online and face-to-face community engagement projects in schools, prisons and community organisations. He's been shortlisted for the 2020 Times Higher Most Innovative Teacher Award and has consulted for NGOs and governmental organisations, including the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, for whom he's designed and developed an open access education tool to support the Education for Justice initiative, which is a UN-sponsored programme supporting anti-corruption, integrity and ethics education in universities worldwide. Hugh's been academic advisor on the critically acclaimed three-part BBC Two and OU television documentary series called The Detectives, which was broadcast in 2018, and he's currently advising on the production of another four-part TV series to be broadcast in 2020 or early 2021, which follows the work of Greater Manchester Police. In terms of his involvement with the DPER programme, Hugh began his PhD studies at Lancaster in 2018. He's a member of cohort 23, which is the 23rd cohort in a row, currently of 25 years, of course, so that's 23 years in he started, and has now moved into part 2, which means he's doing his thesis under the supervision of Dr. Mellis Sim. So Hugh, the floor is yours. Please tell us about your research interests.
Brett, thank you very much for the invitation to speak and for that very, very kind introduction, which is almost as long as the speech I've prepared to talk about my research. Thank you, thank you very much indeed. So I'll just, I took the liberty of preparing a few slides, partly really to just to guide myself to make sure I keep the time, and I'm just going to share those with you now so you can see what I'm looking at. Yeah, so my name's Hugh McFall, cohort 23 of the doctoral program in education research, and I've survived the program far enough to get to part 2. So I was writing my confirmation document during the deep part of the lockdown, so that was quite a difficult experience looking after a 5-year-old child and doing that, but thankfully with the support of Mellis and others I was able to get through that. So I thought I'd divide the time I've got into three aspects, just to give you some background. Before, what was I doing before I started the program? what I'm doing at the moment and where I've got to so far, and then how I think the program is going to inform my future research direction. So following those three prompts, how did I come to take part in the program? Well, as Brett mentioned, my day job is working in the Open University Law School, and a few years ago we set up the Open Justice Centre, and the aim of that centre was to engage our distance learning law students in open access education around clinical legal education, so taking experiential learning into a distance learning setting. So that's quite an unusual undertaking. So it's very common in law schools for people to use different types of pro bono or public good work experience to supplement their academic studies. But this is something that's quite difficult to engineer in a distance learning environment. So kind of things I mean would be advice clinics, going into community settings, schools, prisons and so on, giving legal information seminars, that kind of thing. So I just started to get my head around this project, and I'd had some previous research experience more related to more black letter law issues, human rights, the intersection of law and religion. So I'd had some limited experience of publication and research, but I felt that this was a really good time to undertake the program because I knew I would be able to combine my professional job of bringing this new type of teaching approach into distance learning education, and to use that, the PhD program, to unpick, explore and research the work I was doing, partly to make sure I was doing it right and getting the most out of the opportunity, but also to use it as a source of research that might be useful for other colleagues facing similar issues about integrating online learning into modern universities. So that was the kind of motivations and some of the interests. So the background was technology, open access learning, distance education, and also a background interest in philosophical approaches to law, human rights, law and religion, that kind of thing. So how did it all go? Well, I'd certainly like to publicly thank again Gemma for her input and help with the first paper I wrote in part one. So I was able to benefit from her insights into realist evaluation approaches, and I use that as a framework to evaluate how a virtual reality application had been used on our program. So that was the first piece, which has now been published in the British Journal of Education Technology. So the program here gave me the opportunity to explore different research approaches using empirical research, qualitative interviews, a small amount of quantitative data, to try and make a kind of a thoroughgoing evaluation of the impact that this technology had on the students. So that for me was a learning experience from a methodological point of view, and it gave me the space and the support to engage in some of the debates in the wider literature around these issues. Since then, again, I'd like to thank Paul for his input, because his assignment for researching, teaching and learning is still held up as a piece of good practice within the program. So his the tingle factor assignment was passed around as a piece of good practice. I didn't know he was the author until I was doing some research in preparation for today. So that really helped inform my approach to looking at more general ideas about theory and practice. So that was very useful. So I've started to look at in this article, how to what extent theoretical considerations, theoretical engagement, theorizing in general is useful for a practice-based subject such as clinical legal education. So I've made some recommendations for future research and practice there. And then the final piece engaged again with some support and impetus and inspiration from members of the department to engage in looking at the social justice dimensions of the work I was doing in more sharply focused look at the social justice dimension. So I've been looking at the capabilities approach to legal education, and what the the capabilities approach to justice can say and inform about my teaching practice. So that was part one. So I managed to get through that, get some good publications out, and that was one of the things that attracted me to the program, that it looked like a stepping stone towards publications. In part two, I've taken some of those interests and taken them in a more a kind of holistic approach, really, where instead of just looking at my own work in terms of clinical legal education, to look more holistically at the public engagement practices of law schools and by extensions of universities in general. So at the moment I'm using the capability approach again, so I'm taking that over from part one and looking at some of the theory around epistemic justice, Miranda Fricker's work, to consider the role and potential role of law schools in their civic engagement with members of the public beyond their student base. So that work's ongoing. It's perhaps not going as quickly as I perhaps anticipated, but I'm still on track, and thanks to the guidance of Melis, my supervisor, that seems to be going well. So I've enjoyed that. So where does this leave me then in terms of the future of my research? So I'm not looking for a new job. The whole point of doing this PhD program was to enrich and expand my practice within the Open University Law School. And I think there's certain themes that I think I'll be exploring further, and in some of the non-course related publications I've already begun to do so. And that is, to think carefully about what the public function of universities is. What should we expect in terms of the civic role of universities, especially in relation to their what Amartya Sen framed as their imperfect obligation. So clearly, high up on any university's agenda should be its students, its research stakeholders, and so on. But what about this kind of more peripheral but equally resonant and important aspect of their engagement beyond their natural base, which is the public as I conceive it, and in the context of the Open University, kind of marginalised groups. So that's really what I'd like to pursue and take forward based on the work in part two of my PhD. And then also to look further into the role technology can play in delivering higher education and making it as accessible as possible. So clearly, this is a very relevant topic at the moment, given the fact that many colleagues in face-to-face universities are having to adapt to online technologies. And I've just recently published another couple of articles, one on using smartphone apps to disseminate public legal information, which just came out in Research and Learning Technology. And then there's one in Press, which we've taken the learning that has gone on in our project, informed by my research on the programme, to really give other people a blueprint who are following the journey that we've already made in taking clinical legal education online. So that's some of the directions I'm moving to in my own work, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions when it comes to it on any of the detail of those papers, or what it felt like to be doing that kind of research while being this dual role of a PhD student and also a lecturer in a law school. So thanks for taking the time to come to listen to my reflections on what it's like to be a member of the programme. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Hugh. That was really interesting. We can take perhaps one or two questions now if anyone has them. Nobody's posted in the group chat, although one thing I could certainly raise is you used this metaphor of the stepping stones. You said you used part one as a set of stepping stones into research. Are you able to say anything about how that worked for you and what you were trying to do there?
Well, I think it's interesting because I suppose what part one I felt gave me was the almost a safe space to experiment with different methodologies, different approaches, to benefit from the experience of other more experienced academics in the kind of work that they've been doing. To have it felt like I was able to experiment with different approaches in a way that the normal kind of merry-go-round of the pressure to publish within a normal academic environment wouldn't have given me. So it's an opportunity to step back and to explore what options there were. So the structure of the program in part one, for anyone who's not familiar with it, is that you're encouraged to write essentially 3 assignments, which are journal article length, around 6,000 or 7,000 words, and to try and think about what kind of journal this would go in for. So the whole process of part one is set up to encourage you to explore in a supportive way topics that you might be interested in researching. So in that sense, taking these 3 short steps to publishing 3 articles is a good way, I think, of scaffolding into part 2, which is the longer and more wide-ranging study. So I think that in a way, I can see that you guys didn't just throw the program together. Some thought did go in at some point in thinking how you could take people who are perhaps not used to publications, not used to this type of research. How can you get them from making progress straight away and feeling that you've already made an impact once you get the first few published, and then moving into something that can, I think, nourish and enrich your future research directions. So yeah, that's what it felt like for it to be scaffolded.
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. Fiona, you had a question too.
Yes, I've got a research question for you, Hugh. I was interested that you were using Sen's work and the capability approach, because that's something that I'm toying with and looking at. However, people have said that actually sometimes it's kind of quite a conceptual approach and not very easy to apply in practice. So I was interested to hear what your experience of it was.
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. Yeah, I mean, I think the way I've done it in the article I've written already, which is coming out in a book of edited collection in early in the new year, was to actually take a conceptual approach. What I was trying to do was to say that the capability approach can nudge the literature on clinical legal education in a way that it can give a more coherent account of what the social justice impact of student pro bono activity could be. So for me, I think it offers quite a rich framework. But I think in general, I would say that from what I've read on the capabilities approach, that it does offer quite a practical framework for you to engage in kind of some empirical research. So Melis's recent book, my supervisor, who's a part of the department, she uses this approach in terms of women's experience of education in Turkey and so on. So there's some quite granular work done using the capabilities approach. I would recommend you join the Human Development and Capabilities Association, the HDCA, which you should just Google if you haven't already. And you'll see there the variety of work that's done under the capabilities umbrella. And I think you'll see that that nervousness that you might have, or you've been told to be careful of, that it's overly conceptual. I disagree. I think it's quite a loose framework, and I think it invites cross-disciplinary work, and also it invites people to into some quite practical questions. So to try to answer those. So very happy to chat more about this in detail. So feel free to get in contact. It'd be good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Hugh and Fiona. Okay, so Hugh is a current student on the programme, and we're going to move next to hear from Professor Paul Clemen, who is an alumni, a graduate of the programme. So, and once again, I'll just briefly read. Paul is a higher education consultant with CL Associates, and a visiting professor. He joined cohort 8 of the doctoral programme in 2003 and was awarded his PhD in 2008. His thesis was titled Thinking, Making, Doing, Solving, Dreaming, the Experience of Creativity in Higher Education, Learning and Teaching. Paul has a national and international reputation as a consultant and speaker, and his research on creativity and assessment is cited widely in books and journals across a range of disciplines. He originally trained and worked as a theatre designer and worked successfully as a designer, director and writer before, as he says, accidentally stumbling into teaching in higher education. He was a founding tutor of the Liverpool Institute for Performing Arts before becoming Deputy Director of Palatine, the UK Subject Centre for Dance, Drama and Music. The Subject Centre was based at Lancaster University, which is literally a stone's throw from where we're based in the Department of Educational Research. So thanks, Paul. We're looking forward to hearing about your scholarship.
Right, thanks very much, everyone. I'll just share my screen if I can. Okay, is that working? Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to participate in this celebration of the doctoral program. My interest in creativity was not and is not a subject of purely academic interest. As an arts practitioner in both performing and visual arts, and then as an educator and researcher, so I had a professional interest in sort of creative process, the production of creative products, creative learning and teaching, and the assessment of creativity for a long time. And there were many varied paths that led to my study of creativity in higher education. Alongside that, I'd also become increasingly interested in complexity theory and chaos theory, and particularly how those ideas operated within higher education. And in particular, I was interested in what I later called learning at the edge of chaos. That point right at the edge of chaos, far from the security of certainty and agreement, where creativity, originality, excitement, adventure, and passions thrive, but where it can also be really risky, anxiety-inducing, disorientating, all the things that frighten those in higher education who prefer things like order, conformity, compliance, standardization, etc. So joining the doctoral program provided me with the opportunity and importantly the motivation to explore and focus my research interests. It also crucially provided me, in regard to the other 16 members of cohort 8, with a ready-made support group and a fantastic range of really interesting individuals and teachers, and I shall always be eternally grateful to them. My study set out to explore, using a phenomenographic methodology, the qualitatively different ways in which university teachers experience and conceptualize creativity in relation to their own learning and teaching practice. The intention was to explore how those conceptions of creativity related to the domains, fields, discourses, practices within which academics situate their professional and pedagogic practice. The specific research questions that my study aimed to answer were, as you can see, first, what are the different ways in which university teachers understand the concept of creativity in the context of learning and teaching? And second, what is the nature of the qualitative differences between those conceptions and how are they structured and related? One of the first things I did was to design and send out an online survey about definitions of creativity, always problematic, and attitudes towards creativity. That went out across several of the networks I was connected with. That generated 68 full detailed responses, as well as providing a pool of willing interviewees from a range of disciplines. The survey responses, once I'd categorized the active verbs individuals used to describe their experience of creativity, also provided what eventually became the thesis of my, the title of my thesis, Thinking, Making, Doing, Solving, Dreaming. Among the various things that my study produced was a conceptual map or framework in which creativity was conceptualized as a hierarchy consisting of 5 different but related conceptions. First, there was the idea of the conception of creativity as constrained. People I interviewed talked about things like their creativity being constrained by the system they're working in, or creativity constrained by peers and peer pressure. I remember distinctly one of my interviewees had been told in no uncertain terms, quote, "Forget that creative teaching stuff, you need to focus on your research and publications." And then there was creativity constrained by the requirements of the curriculum they were teaching, but also, and really importantly, engaging in creativity as a reaction or resistance to those constraints. Then there was creativity as process, which can be perceived as creativity leading to an explicit or tangible outcome, or creativity leading to an implicit or intangible outcome. But most interesting of all, in the context of education, was the idea, the conception of creativity not linked to any outcome at all, either implicit or explicit. Then there was creativity as product, seen simply as the creation of something new and original, or the creation of a product that's new and original that is also judged, and by whom is a really interesting question, but I haven't got the time for that now, to have value and utility. Then there was creativity as transformation, perceived as creativity that leads to a fundamental or incremental change. This often involves taking risks, encounters with serendipity, and the unexpected, stumbling with confidence, but can also be a thrilling adventure. And finally, there was creativity as conceived as freedom and fulfillment, an engagement with creativity that engenders a real sense of freedom and opportunity and can lead to genuine personal or professional fulfillment. I also, as part of my research, looked inevitably at the existing research on complexity and research on conceptions of knowledge, learning, teaching in higher education. And I discovered that the conceptual models and frameworks that emerged from that research had a similar trajectory or pattern as the one I was constructing from my own research, from closed, restricted, constrained conceptions towards far more open, freer, transformative conceptions. And the fact that I was able to eventually to construct a model in which what I was constructing for my research into conceptions of creativity mapped really closely onto established models of complexity and also models of knowledge, learning, and teaching was a form of validation in a way. It gave me a sense that I was onto something that was on the right track. And then just before I had completed writing my thesis, serendipity played its part. There was a major international cross-disciplinary conference in the UK entitled Creativity or Conformity, Building Cultures of Creativity in Higher Education. And I presented a paper based on my research at that point, which focused on that conceptual map and those 5 conceptions of creativity in learning and teaching. Then following the conference, a leading educational journal produced a special edition based on the conference proceedings, and my paper Towards Transformation happened to be the lead article in that. Now, to date, that article has been cited over 200 times in books and journals across a wide range of disciplines, which is very nice. But more importantly, and as the validity of educational research lies in its utility, that conceptual framework has been used to inform innovative approaches to learning, teaching, evaluation, and assessment in a number of courses and programs across a range of disciplines. I was particularly struck recently by its use in an accountancy program in Australia and in a journal article entitled Creative Accountancy. So I would describe being on the doctoral program as a pivotal point in what was a relatively late point in my own life and career. It led to all sorts of interesting work, and a significant amount of my work since 2008 can be traced right back to the work and experiences on the doctoral program. It was a truly creative process, a transformative experience. And just as in that conceptual framework, that experience was risky, it was disorienting at times, encountering the unexpected, exploiting serendipity. It was also a thrilling adventure, and that was personally and professionally fulfilling. It made me realize that I had perhaps had something to say about creativity, that I was still very curious about the world, and the program gave me the tools, the support, the opportunity, and crucially, the confidence to say it. It also made me realize that it's never too late, and that there is no path. The path forms itself as you walk it. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. That was very interesting. I can see someone typing, but in the interim, perhaps I can pose a question. which was, you started out, Paul, by saying, I think I wrote it down as something like, it certainly wasn't a purely scholarly interest. You know, that there's certainly a sense in which this is a personal, professional, passion and expertise driven project. So can you say something about your experience of turning something like that into a research project that's in some sense bounded? What was your approach to the relationship between your personal passions and a research project?
I think it was tortuous and problematic, I think, at that time. No, it was, I mean, at the time, I mean, that creativity has like grown on the agenda. So we talk about the creative arts, like, you know, easily. What's always interested me, that we never talk about the creative sciences, for example. That's always sort of annoyed me. So what is it about creativity? And you know, there's this thing that we all like it. You know, if you ask someone, you know, do they like creativity? The idea of creativity, they say yes, they do. But when you come to try and define what it is, there's massive arguments and discussions about it. So some idea of sort of trying to have some way to actually pin some of that down and to actually explore that in some depth, in an educational context, in a research context, which is really appealing, because then you can actually say, well, you know, here it is. You know, accept it or not, but at least here, you know, it's backed up by some decent evidence. You know, there's some research-based evidence here behind what I want to say.
Okay. So a pin it down metaphor. Okay, Paul, I think you've got a question from Paul.
Hi, Paul. Good to see you. Yeah, no, I was really interested in your comments about the position of constraints, because I think very often creativity can be defined as promoted by the absence of constraint, whereas often creativity happens in the face of constraints. So I'll be interested, you know, do you have a view from the kind of wide range of work you've done about what kinds of constraints seem to block creativity and the kinds of constraints that tend to facilitate creativity?
Yeah, so if I can go back, I'd explain it by, if I can go back to that edge of chaos diagram. It makes more sense then. Hold on a second, let me quickly go back. You see that all the interesting, when you talk about, people talk about creativity and you look at creativity, all the interesting creative work happens at the edge of chaos very often. But there is a constant gravitational pull, particularly in education, particularly in higher education, towards certainty and agreement. Things like, you know, our module specs say that at the end of this module, the student will be able to. QA, quality assurance testing. So there's a constant gravitational pull towards order, conformity, standardization. And we spend, as academics, university teachers, a lot of the people I spoke to, and I'm sure a lot of us here, you spend actually quite a lot of time and energy trying to resist that gravitational pull. And actually, for a long time, when I was putting it all together, coding it, and all the rest of it, this constraint thing kept on coming up, and I kept on pushing it to one side, saying, well, it can't be, you know, it's not about constraints. But in the end, I think after talking about it with you and Paul and other people, it was clearly an important element within that. And those constraints come from all parts. And as I just said in my little piece, it comes from the system people operating in. Sometimes it comes from peers and peer pressure, or simply the historical baggage of a particular department or faculty. So and often it happens. So you find creative things happening, but they're not embedded within the system. It's usually the maverick, you know, the maverick academic trying something new, trying something different. So that's where the pressures are. The pressures are down at that bottom end there, in terms of, you know, all the pressures about order, conformity, standardization, coming from all sorts of all sorts of perspectives and places within higher education institutions.
That's great. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, so we've heard now from a current student and a graduate of the programme. So we're now going to hear next from a member of staff who teaches on the programme. So Dr. Gemma Derek is a senior lecturer higher education in the Department of Educational Research. Her research concentrates on the cultural adoption and orientation towards evaluation methods and tools. This includes how metrics and proxies for academic excellence are used within constructed arguments in evaluation narratives and discourse. She has a speciality in researching peer review and currently leads PEARL, the Peer and Expert Review Laboratory, where she is researching research failure and aiming to build a kinder, more responsive peer review system and culture. She is also the editor-in-chief of the journal Publications. Gemma joined the department in 2016 and currently teaches a module on the DPER program called Evaluative Cultures in Higher Education, which raises, or attempts to raise, student awareness of the culture of research and its place within global and civic universities. So, Gemma, can you tell us something about your research? You're muted, Gemma. Gemma, you're muted. You need to unmute.
That was a great start, wasn't it? So I'm actually not going to use slides this time because I'm using this on my iPad and I'm just not technologically advanced to do this. But I just wanted to say I joined the department in 2016, as you said, and as Hugh also mentioned, I had the pleasure of having him as a student in 2018, was it, Hugh? On the evaluative cultures of higher education. And I think when I came to the department in 2016, you know, the DPER module had already been going on for 20 years. Now it's 25 years. So if you think how much DPER has changed in 25 years, so has the research landscape around higher education. So when I joined DPER, when I joined the DPER program, I came in hand with, you know, I came in with different knowledge and hand in hand with the changing higher education landscape. And specifically, I'm a little bit different from what had been done previously on DPER. Is I don't concentrate on factors associated with learning and teaching or in higher education, but I research. Basically, I research research, which makes the DPER program really quite interesting for me. Because as Hugh said, one of the characteristics of the DPER program is that we try to encourage and offer support for our students to publish during part one and then in part two as a way of training them about how to, you know, how to publish a research, how to disseminate it, and how to operate within an academic environment. So I find it really interesting to be part of this program because it mirrors the training and grounding academia, whilst my module and my research basically studies it at the same time. So I find that a really interesting perspective to be on. So I'm the module convener for a module called Evaluative Cultures in Higher Education, which looks at the theories around evaluation and the empirical aspect about how to operationalize an evaluation, as is evidenced by Hugh's work. But I also look at the competing cultures between the culture of research and the culture of higher education, and higher education specifically within national contexts. So if you look at the landscape of science, higher research is very much embedded in higher education, in the higher education discipline, but it's also very close to innovation studies, science and technology studies, what's called meta research or team studies. And what this means is that within this landscape, it's extremely highly interdisciplinary, which means that there are insights coming from the STEM subjects as much as it's coming from the traditional social science subjects. So we work with a lot of psychologists, a lot of linguists, a lot of economists, and a lot of physicists and scientists, all of who are taking an increased interest in their research and researching the culture that what's in it. So let me get back to this idea about competing cultures. When I talk about competing cultures, on one hand, you've got the culture of higher education. And for this, I'm taking it largely from a UK perspective, where it is performative, heavily marketized. There is always a debate about whether it serves a public or a private good. And there are external stakeholders that the university is accountable to in one way or another. What happens is that research, which is actually quite large, Research is global, it crosses boundaries, as knowledge crosses boundaries and by definition has no boundaries. Research has an increased commitment to open science, open access, open practice, open data, which contrasts to an idea that higher education should be producing research for its own personal or its own private needs, for example. It's also highly collaborative. We work with, and highly international. We work quite freely with people across the borders, which means that ownership can also be ownership can also be something that is heavily debated within higher education policy. And we are, even though we're committed to being open and open and collaborative, we are in essence an elitist organization or elitist culture that has to fight against ideas that we are closed, that we are part of an ivory tower, and the fact that quality research is research that is supposedly done without the interferences of outside interferences, which includes engagement with the public, etc. Engagement with the public, engagement with stakeholders, engagement with anything that might tarnish our research. And what that does, it creates a culture that is heavily competitive. And it's very interesting as part of this program because our assessment schedule for most of the core modules, as Hugh said, is to produce a publishable piece or a piece that can be pushed towards publish. And we support our students in which to do that. That also means that as part of that assessment schedule, we in a way provide a safe space so people can, or our students can experiment with the different types of theories, methods and perspectives that make the higher education discipline so rich, but in a very safe place so we can provide feedback to prepare them in a way for the horrors that is the peer review, scholarly peer review system. And what we have done is we have a very interesting assessment design that takes into account both a formative and summative assessment that mirrors the peer review process. So not only do we provide formative assessment feedback to our students in which to improve and strengthen the piece, but we also encourage the students to actually respond to us to make informed decisions about how or if they're even going to take on our suggestions to improving and to defend their research. That means that after they have been given their marks and have carried on to another module or part 2, they are prepared to submit their publication for a journal and also prepared to handle the inevitable reviewer 2 that always comes back. And we all know that reviewer 2 can never be a nice person, but that's interesting. So I find my module and participating in DPER extremely interesting, both as my practice as a teacher, but also in my research as a researcher, or what we call in my field meta research. Okay, so it's the researcher research, so we just call it meta research. Specifically at the moment, my research focuses on two different projects. One is the evaluation or valorization, if you want to be take a European perspective, because when you evaluate something, you inherently always assign value to something. So you are always going to separate winners from losers. So I always look at the evaluation of the wider benefits of research and the wider benefits of research within higher education context. Specifically, I'm known for doing a lot of research into audit frameworks on national levels, which includes in the UK base, the Research Excellence Framework, Excellence in Research Australia in other countries, and it comes in different forms in Italy, the Netherlands, Sweden, in Norway, New Zealand even, so it's a good thing. Most of the time, the way that value is assigned to research outputs is through a mechanism called peer review. And this type of peer review that I study is different from peer review for the scholarly publication process, which is something which is what I've mentioned before. Peer review of this point usually takes place in various forms in groups where people come together and they argue for the benefits and drawbacks of particular submissions in front of them. And I study that process. And specifically, when I talk about the wider benefits of research, I don't necessarily look at traditional outputs of research through productivity, such as publications, patents, grants, etc., although that comes into it. But I'm really quite interested in how value is assigned to the wider societal benefits of research, as what we call in the UK impact or societal impact, which is stuff that research within higher educations is conducted for some sort of benefit of a society. And I look at the sector-wide implications of these somewhat subjective judgments done by groups of what we call experts or peers, it's peer review, on the wider higher education sector. My previous research has been done, or mainly done, on the research excellence frameworks here in the UK. And also the stress that that puts onto the system and how that in it by extension influences research behaviour and policies that are designed to influence research behaviour. On the flip side, my research at the moment through the Peer and Expert Review Laboratory, or PEARL as we call it, is again extending this idea of peer review. The whole idea of a pearl in a black box. Peer review has been known to be called a black box, and the idea that within a black box there can be something very beautiful is the artistic reasoning for PEARL as an acronym. But I'm researching research failure, which is something a bit different from what has been done previously. Previously, research and meta-research concentrates on success. I mean, you look at successful people, you look at publications that have been achieved, you look at successful grant applications, and you try to work backwards and say, if these guys were successful, the characteristics of these means success. Whereas I take a different point of view. I take an idea that in order to build a kinder, more responsive research culture, which is another thing that I'm very committed to, we need to look at not just measures of success or cases of success, but cases of failure. Only when we flip the map of science from being a map of who's been successful to a map of who's been unsuccessful do we get to see what parts of research or types of people or types of biases the research culture is actually endemic. It is endemic in the research culture. So by flipping that perspective, looking at who misses out, we get an idea about how research can operate better. And this is a research that I'm doing with in partnership with the Wellcome Trust, which is one of the world's biggest funding agencies. And specifically, we're looking at how people take on feedback over time to create more successful applications in the future, and how we can tailor the feedback and peer review process that is used at the Wellcome Trust and hopefully into the future by other funding agencies as well, to basically produce a research culture that mirrors what we do on the DPER program, that basically sees the feedback that you get from a rejected funding agency should not necessarily mean the end, but instead should be able to give you the tools to make it stronger in the future. And so for that way, and that particular project, my experience on the DPER program and the assessment design that we have and the uniqueness of this design is really much informing how I'm using my research and my experience in DPER to create a better, fairer and more responsive research culture. Hopefully that kind of means we'll have better responses, better societal impacts, and more powerful research as well. So that's me within 10 minutes.
I think, Bernard, you had a question for Gemma.
Yeah, thanks very much, in fact, to Gemma and the other two speakers, and hi to Paul and Fiona, who I've known off the programme too. I'm kind of fascinated by the fact that both Paul and you, there was an identity development as a researcher, and how as an evaluator, Gemma, you would kind of go about evaluating identity development and continual professional development. And certainly in my own case, the programme had really kind of substantial benefits in terms of my persona, I suppose.
Sorry, Bernard, could you repeat that question?
Yeah, in terms of evaluating the benefits of research, how might you accommodate identity development as a researcher in terms of the positive benefits of the programme, for example, on us as people and researchers?
I'm not really quite sure how to answer that. Hugh, do you want to have a go, or to Paul? You've been developing your identities as researchers throughout this program.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and Paul to do whenever you. Well, I think that's a really good question. I think the program is designed to try and foster people who are interested in research to foster certainly their confidence and capacity to engage in research. I hadn't thought about it in terms of changing my own sense of personal identity, but I suppose now you put the question, I think that does happen, because I would conceive myself now as someone who's active in academic research. And I suppose with my realist evaluation head on, which I can, Gemma into, I suppose I'd be thinking of a way in which, could you do an impact evaluation of this program in terms of the identity formation of people as researchers? I think there's certainly an article in there, definitely.
I was thinking about that in terms of, I remember thinking, joining doctoral practice, is my identity becoming an academic researcher any different to my identity as an arts researcher, which I've been doing anyway. And I think the only difference is that I think there are rules of the game, and one learns to play. I suppose one learns to play the rules of the game in order to break them if necessary. So I just wondered, I never thought of myself as an academic researcher. I always thought of myself as an artist, or primarily an artist engaging in some form of academic research, which is slightly different. So even though I've got papers published, I've got book chapters that are written, I still don't see myself as an academic researcher in that sense. I suppose I've got a foot in both camps as an arts researcher and an academic researcher, but I still feel slightly hesitant about saying yes, I'm definitely an academic researcher, because I came into it from a very different route, and I suppose I practice it slightly differently, even though I understand the rules of the game.
I think for me, I'm a meta researcher, so my identity is always in flux, Bernard.
Yeah, I quite like the idea of us being in flux. I think that's part of going along Paul's formative path.
I always remember the psychologist R.D. Laing in his book Knots. Don't know if anyone remembers that book. It's about the incredible complex entanglements, personal entanglements we get ourselves into. But the opening poem in that goes, "They are playing a game, and I know they are playing a game. But if I reveal I know they are playing a game, they will punish me. Therefore, I play the game." And I think that's part that we all learned. I think we all learned. We learned to do that. And we get hit sometimes, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, which I was really interested in Gemma's thing about failure, because in my own work, I talk about and write about the idea of the glorious failure, where it's, particularly in education, we should, if you believe in creativity and enabling creativity, you've got to allow for failure. And it's not about, and you don't like the word failure, I think you just learn, it's a learning experience. Okay, it didn't work out that time. What can we learn from it? So you look at rewarding the learning and not penalizing the failure.
I think that's what's very interesting about this research at the moment, Paul, is that the research culture as it stands not only doesn't reward failure, because that would be a problem, but it doesn't allow for failure as part of like a long-term development. We only reward success. And when you look at researchers, they always talk about how well they've done. They can talk about this, our CVs are a measure of our success, but if we actually, put a CV of failure up, it would be 3 times as long, and it would show a more accurate portrayal of Bernard, our identity development as researchers.
As Samuel Beckett said, fail again, fail better.
Exactly. I don't fail small. I fail big. I mean, you're gonna do it. You got to do it right.
We have probably like 2 minutes left, so if anyone has a burning question, then now it would be now or forever hold your peace. We're looking for cross-cutting themes. One of the things that struck me about what all of you have said is the interrelationship between the education component of what you're doing and other disciplines. You know, so none of you seem to be purely characterizing yourself as educational researchers. Does anyone want to comment on the relationship between education and some other discipline in their research?
Well, I trained as a medic, so my identity is crazy, but you're a legal person, perhaps you can comment.
Yeah, well, I think similar. So I was trained as a lawyer, and I would say, you know, education is inherently, you know, has cross-disciplinary aspects. I suppose you could argue there are elements that are strictly and exclusively educational, but it lends itself to concepts and attitudes and methods do lend itself to interdisciplinary work. I mean, you know, some people did ask me why, if you work in a law school, did you do an education PhD? And for me, it doesn't seem to be a contradiction at all, because my interests are a lot around making legal education open access and legal empowerment. And I think education and the law, there's a strong link there. So for me, that's not a problem at all. It's certainly a strength of the program, that it can encourage interdisciplinary work. And Fiona mentioned the capabilities approach. I think that's a really good example of how, you know, these kind of approaches can be very, very fertile.
Yeah, coming from a theatre background, you know, we're used to different roles and adopting different roles and learning. You know, so in one sense, it makes, you know, you just shift depending on what is necessary at the time. I don't think you stick in any one role for any. I think it's wrong. Well, no, not wrong. It's not healthy to just stick in one role, or let the role take you over, for that matter. Much better to be able to move, you know, to be able to shift roles, and depending on your audience and depending on the work that you're engaged with.
I think it's important, just as a final topic, and I think this is one of the strengths of the DPER program, is that, you know, research being a culture that requires excellence, and that idea of excellence is being redefined as we go. It's not necessarily discipline specific at the moment, but the greatest benefit a researcher can be is to be agile and flexible. That's, you know, selection of methods, selections of theories, and not necessarily beholden to one worldview entirely, but actually be open to being wrong and changing it. And on DPER, knowing myself included, but also knowing the other module conveners as well, we come from a variety of different backgrounds, and therefore, by essence of teaching what we teach, we also represent these strengths and the necessity to be agile, and we also foster it in our students as well, who come from, as you can see, a variety of different backgrounds.
It's a very good point on which to draw things together and to a close, Gemma. Yeah, I think what we've clearly established is that the research community around the DPER program is very, very varied. People are coming from very different backgrounds. Hugh talked about traveling across a series of stepping stones from what Paul characterized as not a purely scholarly interest. So I think what we've raised, and Gemma raised this very well, is that there's a culture that we're trying to create that's very nurturing and that's very distinctly interdisciplinary. And that's what the program is all about, is fostering a research culture that is inclusive and dynamic, while also very, very varied. I'd say that's probably the core message I certainly got out of today's seminar. So thank you very much all for coming. I hope you all found it enjoyable, and that includes those watching on the recording afterwards. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to draw the event to a close.
Thank you.